Okay, this is it. Day 3 of LaConference beginning. I hope everyone's been having a great time. I've been more than happy, more than surprised with the turnout, the enthusiasm, participation. It's really exciting for me. I'm just going to say a few words, some reflections on the last few days. I'll introduce Paul, and then we'll begin his presentation on the function and field of speech and psychoanalysis. Over the last months, I've been reading Simone Weil's Gravity and Grace. It's been an exhausting couple of months, and the text has been amazingly nurturing and sustaining. I came across a passage a couple weeks ago, and she spoke of how to relate to God, basically. I'm not much of a believer, but who knows? We'll get to the end of this book. In any case, she reflects on what it means to do something for God, and that one always fails when they do something for God, and that the only way really to relate to God, to do God's work, is to do it by God, to allow God, whatever, to pass through you. In any case, with regard to this conference, the Lacan Salon, I've been thinking a lot, what motivated me to take on the project, to invest the time, who or what am I doing it for? Why do we get together as the Lacan Salon every 2 weeks? Certainly we don't do it for our money, for careers, and yet we continually show up. And somehow I think that relation, or whatever relation we take in the Lacan Salon, whatever relation I took to this conference, is a kind of a buy. By what, I don't know. By a kind of grace, Simone would say, for sure. Perhaps a grace of desire rather than God. But if you read the text, you'll see that she defines it in strikingly similar ways as Lacan. So it's been a real pleasure working on this project with a number of people. Paul Kingsbury and Hilda Fernandez, thank you so much for your support in the months. Clint Burnham, for your support over the years with the Lacan Salon. Amy Kazimirchik, I don't believe she's here yet, but helped me a great deal in planning all of the satellite events. Mateja Kulic, huge support for me, so thank you. And Paul Verhaeghe, thank you for your generosity. This was supposed to be an introduction, and as I was saying to you a moment ago, I hardly know you, so it's a little silly to introduce you. But emailing, which for me is always a rife or challenging relationship, was a pleasure. Your kindness and generosity shone through from the very first moment that we corresponded. So thank you very much for all of that and for the amazing amount of work you've done so far. As I mentioned, Paul's going to speak on the function and field of speech and psychoanalysis. I think it's going to be an amazing lecture. It's going to be a long one. We're going to have a short break in the middle of it, so we can go to the washroom, maybe have some water. Paul has let me know that he'll be giving the paper to me, and I'll be posting it on lacansalon.com. Or you can download it and get it, as all the papers that were presented yesterday will be up on the website this week, with the permission of the authors, which I have, I think, most of them. So, without any further ado, I'm going to do the formal introduction of Paul. Paul is a PhD. Paul Verhaeghe, Dr. Paul Verhaeghe, is a senior professor at Ghent University and holds the chair of the Department for Psychoanalysis and Counseling Psychology. He teaches clinical psychodiagnostics, psychoanalytic therapy, and gender studies. He is an analyst in private practice, member of the NLS and the WAP. He has published 8 books and more than 100 papers. His 2 most recent books bring a critique on contemporary psychotherapy. Paul Verhaeghe.
Okay, we are in for a kind of marathon. I have 1 hour and a half. We'll have a break somewhere in between. When I was asked to present a close reading of Lacan's The Function and Field of Speech and Language and Psychoanalysis, I was not only honored, but also quite happy, because this is one of the most beautifully written Lacanian texts. There are quotes that stick to your memory almost from the first time that you have read them. I cannot judge if this goes for the English translation as well, but the original French has a rare poetic and rhetoric quality, and it was a pleasure to reread it after something like 15 years. I have 3 aims with my talk. First of all, I think it is necessary to introduce you briefly the historical circumstances of this paper. Secondly, I want to address what is fundamentally new in Lacan's discourse compared to the psychoanalytic theory and practice of that time, meaning 1953. And thirdly, finally, I want to explain how he changed himself, his ideas, some 10 years later at the time of Seminar 11. First of all, the historical circumstances. These are so important that I assume that most of you will know about them. At the beginning of 1953, Lacan is the president of the SPP, that is, the Société Psychoanalytique de Paris. In June, he is asked to resign because of the unorthodoxy of his praxis. Basically, this had to do with the fact that he did not follow the standard rules with regard to the fixed duration of a session. In itself, this was not an isolated fact. It was well known that he challenged the training program in many other respects as well, and that he did not agree with the direction in which psychoanalysis was moving at that time. As a reaction to this imposed resignation, Daniel Lagache, the vice president of the same organization, refused to take the president's seat and resigned as well. He started a new institute, the SFP, the Société Française de Psychanalyse, and more than 20 members of the previous organization followed, and Lacan, of course, is one of them. To my surprise, I have found an entry in Louise's bourgeois diary, you can see it, where she has noted, "Today is the birthday of the French Psychoanalytical Society, together with all the names and addresses." She must have had very close connections with the Parisian analytic scene to have received this information that early. There was probably not even a telephone connection at that time. It must have been by a cable. You see Lacan on the at 7 o'clock. Lacan is noted. Then you with the address. Okay. Just by way of anecdote, I thought it was interesting enough to show this to you. In September of the same year, so 1953, the Congress of Psychoanalysts coming from Romance-speaking countries was already planned in Rome, and the official French delegation was still the SPP. As a reaction, the new institute held a kind of shadow conference alongside the official one. And it is during that conference that Lacan presented what will be known afterwards as his Discours de Rome. That is, he presented an abbreviated version of it. The much larger text itself was distributed in hard copy. In this discourse, Lacan explains his views on psychoanalysis, at least on 3 important points: theoretically, clinically, and the implications for the formation of the analyst. Basically, he criticizes the turn towards ego psychology and object relation theory, and puts forward what will be coined afterwards as his return to Freud. 2 months later, he will give the opening lesson of his first public seminar at the Sainte Anne Hospital, where he will explain why and how Freud's technique is superior compared to the then contemporary one. Before entering the subject, it is worthwhile to remember that at that time, Lacan did not want to resign from the IPA. He hoped that it would be possible to move the international psychoanalytic movement into another direction compared to the neurobiological medical one, let alone in the direction of ego psychology. This explains two of his initiatives, both of which seem odd to us today. First of all, he presented the text of his Discours de Rome to one of the leaders of the French Communist Party. And secondly, he asked his brother, who was a Catholic bishop, to arrange a meeting with the Pope when he was in Rome. Both of these initiatives have to be understood within his intellectual adventure. We are 8 years after the ending of the Second World War, and the French Parisian communists of that time were all Marxists, trained by Kojève in Hegelian dialectics. As you may know, Kojève was one of the leading French intellectuals during the 30s. As a prominent Marxist, he taught Hegel at the École des Hautes Études to the intellectual elite of Paris. And via Kojève, Lacan had understood the link between Hegel and his reading of Freud. The focus is on desire and on the dialectics between the master and the slave in the struggle for recognition. And of course, Lacan had seen more than enough of that in the psychoanalytic institutions. Beside that, it opened the possibility to think the psychoanalytic practice in dialectical terms, instead of focusing on instincts that had to be mastered by the ego. In the same vein, Lacan considered the Catholic theology to be much more interesting than neurobiology, because the Church Fathers had been studying desire and sin for centuries. With these initiatives, Lacan hoped to move psychoanalysis beyond its medical boundaries and to introduce it in the larger intellectual movement of Europe at that time. Both of the initiatives failed, and Lacan had to continue his path alone. The SPP and the SFP went their own way, and in 1959, the SFP asked the IPA for affiliation. It took them 2 years to answer, and in 1961, the SFP was granted the status of study group. Basically, this meant that their training procedures would be carefully watched. And the next year, it became clear that the IPA would only consider a full affiliation on condition that both Lacan and Françoise Dolto were excluded. This became an official statement early 1963 and was accepted by a majority of the SFP only in November. As a result, Lacan was expelled from the IPA and had to start his own school, and the rest is history. In the following year, that is 1964, Lacan will give his seminar for the first time free from whatever institutional restraints. And the program that he will put forward in Seminar 11 starts with a question about the status of the unconscious. Lesson after lesson, he will inaugurate a truly innovative theory with many corrections on what he had presented in the Rome Discourse. 2 years later, the Écrits are published with the famous discourse in it. As you may have noticed from the footnotes, a number of paragraphs have been rewritten compared to the original version. On top of that, the text is preceded in the Écrits by a newly written introduction with the title Du sujet enfin en question, on the subject who is finally in question. And this finally is very telling. It means that Lacan himself was convinced that the notion of the subject was not elaborated enough in his Rome discourse. I will come back to that in the final part of my talk after our break. So far for the historical circumstances of the paper. Let us address now what is new in it. I will follow the partition that Lacan made himself, meaning that there is a preface and an introduction, followed by 3 chapters. Ironically enough, the preface starts with a quote, as you can see, with a quote from Sacha Nacht, a leading French analyst of that time, who puts forward the idea of neurobiology as the preeminent discipline. Lacan's paper will be one long argument against this kind of reasoning. And the irony, of course, is that it is not too difficult to find contemporary quotes which are expressing the very same idea, meaning that the main thesis of the function and field of speech and language is still very actual. The central theme in this preface is Lacan's vigorous attack on the functioning of psychoanalytic institutions in general and the way they organize or fail to organize the formation of young analysts. And he holds a plea for psychoanalyzing psychoanalysis itself, instead of turning away from it. The first sentence of the introduction explains the reason for this turning away. It has to do with anxiety. And this is one of those beautiful sentences which stick to the mind of the reader even the first time you have read it. Tel est l'effroi qui s'empare de l'homme à découvrir la figure de son pouvoir, qu'il s'en détourne dans l'action même qui est la sienne. Such as the fright that seizes man, etc., etc. The message is clear from the start. We should not turn away from psychoanalysis in spite of our anxiety. And we need to address the function of speech and the field of language instead of focusing on instinct theories and the like. Both of them have been forgotten together with Freud's original theory and original technique. In the following years, Lacan will study Freud's work in German and inaugurate what is known as the Lacanian return to Freud. This brings us to the first section of the paper. The title by itself is already worthwhile to consider. Empty speech and full speech in the psychoanalytic realization of the subject. It puts forward an opposition between 2 forms of speech, empty speech versus full speech, and, more importantly even, it situates this opposition in a process that is characterized by an imperative. Something has to take place, namely the psychoanalytic realization of the subject. This is totally new. Both the idea of the subject and the idea that this subject has to be realized via the process of analysis. Let us not forget that Lacan had started his career with a focus on paranoia and personality, and had moved from there to the theory on the mirror stage and the imaginary, where the je, the I, took the central stage. There was no question of a subject whatsoever. At the end of this first section, Lacan puts himself in the question of the audience by asking the obvious thing, quote, "But what then is this subject that you keep drumming into our ears?" End of the quote. Obviously, this realization is the goal of the analytic praxis, and in Lacan's later work, this becomes even an ethical imperative for the analyst. Remarkably enough, in his later work, the ideas of full and empty speech will disappear, and this asks for an explanation. In his introduction, Lacan had already stressed the fact that psychoanalysis operates through speech. The subject is realized via the process of free association with the analyst in the position of the listener. At first sight, you would expect a progressive and continuous realization of the subject, a kind of discovery journey in the who am I realm, with lots of memory lanes, etc., etc. Apparently, this is not Lacan's idea, even on the contrary. The more this realization takes place, the more certainties disappear. Quote, doesn't the subject become involved here in an ever greater dispossession of himself as a being? End of the quote. Even more importantly, these certainties disappear in relation to the other. And when Lacan describes what Freud already coined as the analytical work, analytische Arbeit, he clearly accentuates the intersubjective nature of this process. For in the work he does to reconstruct it for another, and the italics are in the original, he encounters anew the fundamental alienation that made him construct it like another, and it has always destined it to be taken away from him by another. So, free association does not result in the discovery of who someone really is, even on the contrary. And this brings us to the difference between full speech, parole pleine, and empty speech, parole vide. The first one is sometimes rendered as parole vraie, true speech, but she gives us the idea that empty speech might be false speech. As you may remember or know, about a decade later, in the 60s and the early 70s, expressions like the true self and the false self, the authentic personality and the like, will become very fashionable within the field of psychotherapy. Does this mean that Lacan was ahead of his time? Not at all. Even on the contrary. Such a reading is totally wrong, because full speech has nothing to do with the notions of the true or the false self. True speech does not present the analysand as he truly is, just like empty speech does not necessarily present us with a false picture of the analysand. Even more so, up to a point, empty speech might correspond to a certain reality about the self-image and the way it is perceived by other people. The emptiness has to do with an all too full imaginary, someone who has completely identified with a number of signifiers. And this is the certainty that has to be undermined by the analytic work. Being fully identified with oneself leads to an empty speech and does not leave much opening. As we will see, this opening is necessary because otherwise change is impossible. If we turn now to the idea of full speech, we are a bit at a loss to what it means. Apparently, it does not mean that the analysand finds back the full recollection of his past as it is supposed to have determined him. That would imply, quote, I was this only in order to become what I can be, end of the quote. If the process of analysis amounts to that conclusion, it endorses an already existing alienation that is usually accompanied by a negative certainty in the patient, a kind of Tina syndrome. There is no alternative. The art of the analyst, says Lacan, aims at the suspension of such certainties. Nevertheless, when we look at the elaborations of this full speech, we have to conclude that these elaborations come down to the reconstruction of the patient's history. especially the hidden and the censored part of his history. And Lacan provides us with a beautiful enumeration of the places where the truth is inscribed. The monuments of the body, the archival memories, the family legends, etc. And this conclusion becomes all the more stronger if we read that verbalization of these inscribed truths relates the past to the present as necessities to come. So, what is the difference then with the idea that the subject is determined by his past? In my reading, this is one of the major difficulties of this paper. Lacan is leaving a certain conception of the unconscious, and he is introducing something new, but he is still in between. And in the very same quote, the difference between the old deterministic view and his new conception resides in one word, the word truth. Let's be categorical. As in psychoanalytic anamnesis, what is at stake is not reality, but truth, because the effect of full speech is to reorder past contingencies by conferring on them the sense of necessities to come. We do not have to find back the real facts. No, we are addressing the truth. Now, if we want to define what this truth stands for, based on the discours de Rome, we are at a loss. It will take Lacan about 10 years to grasp the implications of his own analytic experience. In the Rome discourse, we can only feel the direction where this will lead to. True speech is characterized by a commitment with a perspective on the future based on the past. And the core element in this commitment is desire. Desire in relation to the other, meaning that the core of true speech might be characterized as empty. It is precisely this emptiness in true speech that will open the possibility for change. There are at least two new ideas in this approach: the idea of emptiness and the idea of the other. In the Rome discourse, the focus will be on the second one, meaning on the dialectics of desire in relation to the unconscious. And whilst Lacan refreshes our knowledge about the Freudian unconscious, for instance, in the following quote, "The unconscious is the chapter of my history that is marked by a blank or occupied by a lie," while he refreshes our knowledge in that respect with Freud, he introduces his audience to something new, and you can see that in the quote on the screen. The subject goes far beyond what is experienced subjectively by the individual, and the unconscious of the subject is the discourse of the other. Even more so, this discourse goes much further than a relation between two people. And if we don't understand this, then both our theory and our technique won't do. This brings us to the second section: symbol and language as structure and limit of the psychoanalytic field. The previous section addressed speech and left us with a question about the subject. This second section addresses language and will leave us with other questions. A better title would have been Signifier and Language as Structure, etc. The way in which Lacan uses symbol in this paper has created a number of misunderstandings, especially as the idea of symbol evokes a more or less stable relationship with a more or less traditional signification. For instance, the symbol heart for love. For Lacan, it is exactly the opposite. The relationship between a signifier and a signified is arbitrary, as was put forward in the Structural Linguistics by Ferdinand de Saussure. Because this relationship is arbitrary, we, the speaking beings, might make our own choice and name things as it suits us. But this is not allowed because language has made the choice long before our time, hence the field of language. Speech is our individual endeavor in this trans-individual and trans-historical field, as is obvious in the following quote: "The unconscious is that part of concrete discourse qua trans-individual," end of the quote. In view of the arbitrary relationship, signification is based on the convention of a group, that is the other, whilst an actual signification is produced within the chain of signifiers via the laws inherent in language. Free association is not free at all, but demonstrates how the selection and combination of the signifiers follow the same rules, meaning that they are synonymous with the unconscious processes. In this chapter, Lacan illustrates these ideas based on 3 major Freudian works. And the first one is, of course, die Traumdeutung, the interpretation of dreams, with the dream work and the unconscious thought processes interpreted as linguistic processes. This is a return to Freud via linguistics. Interesting and important, but still it is a return. In the same paragraph, we find something new as well. Instead of following Freud about the dream being a wish fulfillment, Lacan uses the dream to demonstrate that man's desire finds its meaning and sense in the desire of the other. And immediately he corrects the misunderstanding that this might provoke. This does not mean that man desires something or someone that belongs to the other. It has nothing to do with a kind of primal jealousy or envy. No, man desires to be recognized by the other via the desire of the other for him. This is Lacan combining Hegel and Freud. The next work is the Psychopathology of Everyday Life, where Lacan finds ample evidence that a symptom is structured as a language. I will come back to this thesis because we have to connect it to the well-known saying, the unconscious is structured as a language. As we will see, at the time of seminar 11, based on his new conception about the unconscious, he will consider symptoms as the always failing productions of this unconscious. But anyhow, in this section of the Rome discourse, there is something remarkable. Instead of focusing on the many linguistic illustrations in Freud's Psychopathology of Everyday Life, illustrations which operate directly on the signifier, he, Lacan, stresses Freud's example about the apparent chance combination of numbers and the determination that lies hidden in them. And this has to do with Lacan's hope of turning psychoanalysis into a science, be it a new kind of science. And the same example returns in the purloined letter, especially in the appendix to this paper. It is by no means a coincidence that the purloined letter is put in front of the écrit against the chronological order of the other papers. It expresses the same hope of turning psychoanalysis into a science. and a number of pages in the Rome Discourse testify to it, especially in this section. So this is an important theme as well, but I don't have enough time to go into it. One of my PhD students in my department is working on this part, and in his opinion, the second chapter of the Rome Discourse can be read as a sort of pamphlet for Lacan's own project for a scientific psychoanalysis. Not only does Lacan demonstrate his adherence to a structural conception of language, he explicitly states his hope of placing psychoanalysis at the heart of what he calls the conjectural sciences. And these sciences start from a basic assumption. In the case of psychoanalysis, this would be the unconscious is structured as language. And the project is to proceed by rigorously constructing the relations between the different elements they encounter in their field, in the hope of finding the laws that operate between them. This results in a mode of comprehension that has repercussions on the way in which interventions are made during the treatment. As such, Lacan's agenda is not only of an epistemological nature, but also an ethical one. Finally, the third Freudian work where Lacan demonstrates the function in the field of language and speech is the one about their wits. Again, Lacan points us to something that is usually missed. The fact that a true wit makes no sense. And this foreshadows an essential shift in the analytic praxis. We do not have to find back hidden, censored meanings, as we may gather from certain passages in the Discours de Rome. At the end of the day, symptoms are meaningless. They make no sense whatsoever, and we have to focus on the dialectical structure beyond these supposed meanings. Later, at the time of Seminar 11, he will tell us that his psychoanalytic interpretation aims at the nonsense, the absence of meaning. And in different places in his work, he will say that a psychoanalysis without laughter is a failed one. I will come back in the final part of my talk to this important idea when I address the question of the subject as a truly Lacanian notion. Now, this application of linguistics to the praxis of psychoanalysis might be nothing more than that, an application that elucidates a number of hitherto rather mysterious processes. But Lacan goes a lot further, based on yet another important reference, namely Levi-Strauss, and behind Levi-Strauss, Marcel Mauss. Language means exchange, and exchange means law in the most fundamental meaning of the word. What is given is less important than the exchange itself, because the fact of giving and receiving determines a recognition. Again, this is new. It introduces psychoanalysis in the field of intersubjectivity, not because there are two people involved, but because every one of us functions in a symbolically determined system of exchanges that determines every possible relationship. And this even before someone opens his or her mouth. Many years later, this will be one of the core ideas in the theory on the four discourses. And this determination operates via what Lacan in 1953 still calls symbols. But again, signifier would have been much more appropriate. A decade later, at the time of Seminar 11, he will abandon the idea of intersubjectivity and replace it by the structural relationship between the subject and the big other as determinative for the becoming of the subject. In hindsight, this is already present in the Rome discourse. He learns his audience that the symbol creates the things, even the thing that man is, with the well-known quote, "Man thus speaks, but it is because the symbol has made him a man." Language imposes a symbolically determined system of exchanges in a structure of kinship, in which every individual speaker is assigned his or her position. This never-ending exchange has to do with what Lacan calls a fundamental depth. And later on in the Rome discourse, we'll learn that the symbol is the murder of the thing. And the superseding law is identified with the symbolic father. But the trouble is that human desire requires to be recognized. And this introduces a number of interferences. From this point onwards, says Lacan, we can see that the problem resides in the relations between speech and language in the subject. And he will describe 3 paradoxes in this relation between speech and language in the subject. The first one concerns psychosis, where the dialectical exchange is missing. The second one concerns neurosis, where the linguistic mechanisms coincide with the unconscious processes. And the final paradox resides in the scientific objectifications of the discourse that leads to a petrifying alienation. More than half a century later, that is now, today, this third paradox has become omnipresent. For this is the most profound alienation of the subject when the subject begins to talk to us about himself. Modern man identifies with what a supposedly scientific society bestows upon him, telling him who he is, how he has to eat, to drink, to sleep, to think, to make love, etc. Even telling him from what kind of disorder he suffers. As you may have experienced yourselves, during the first clinical interview, most of our patients present us with their own diagnostic label found on the internet. To give you an idea of the magnitude this has taken today, a contemporary American receives 3,000 advertising messages per day, which is a continuous indoctrination. In Lacan's words, here it is a wall of language that blocks speech. And the consequence of this wall was immortalized even earlier by T.S. Eliot. Yeah, this one isn't on it. Okay. By T.S. Eliot in The Hollow Man. We are the hollow man, we are the stuffed man, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. Notice the fact that even Eliot starts from an original emptiness. I will come back to that immediately. The effect of these supposedly scientific objectifications is comparable to the first paradox in the relation between speech and language. And Lacan recognized this first paradox in psychosis, but there is one important exception compared to the contemporary alienation based on the scientific discourse. In psychosis, we are addressing something authentic. Here, this is no longer the case. The enormous objectification bestowed upon the contemporary subject makes it very hard to address that what is floating on top of it. In the meantime, this has taken a dimension that goes way beyond the purely quantitative aspect. 3,000 advertisements a day is a lot, but there is even a more fundamental problem. As Lacan explained earlier in the text, with a reference to Rabelais, the symbolic order functions based on a depth, on something that is structurally lacking. And much later in his work, he will coin this as the symbolic castration, the original loss at birth of eternal life that is endorsed by the introduction of the subject in the symbolic order, where we lose the immediacy of the thing. And this loss leads to a never-ending exchange between the subject and the other, and to the typically human creativity. Today, this idea has disappeared. The message coming from the contemporary discourse brings a massive denial of the symbolic castration. The contemporary message is clear. There is no structural lack whatsoever, no symbolic depth either. There is a perfect answer to everything. Find the right product, have the cash ready, and your problem is solved. Enjoy. In matters of counseling and psychotherapy, this has created the illusion that there is a scientifically proven, evidence-based answer for every problem, after the patient has been assessed correctly and thoroughly. If the treatment turns out badly, something must be wrong with the patient, because the system is correct, as it is scientifically proven. This illustrates a shift in the field of science that will allow Lacan many years later, in his paper Science and Truth, to compare contemporary science to paranoia. Just like paranoia, science does not want to know and rejects or forecloses the truth in its status as basic causality. The truth meaning symbolic castration and the ensuing basic uncertainty. This might sound a bit esoteric, but the consequences are huge and real, and in the meantime, they are becoming obvious. Today, everything has to be under control, everything has to be predictable, there is no room for contingencies and uncertainties. Whilst the patriarchy of the former times accepted mistakes based on the original sin, our contemporary Big Brother is merciless. If something goes wrong, then someone has to be blamed, because the system itself is perfect. Last year, we had a very alarming example of such a paranoid reading of science. 6 Italian scientists have been sentenced to 6 years in prison over statements they made prior to the 2009 earthquake that killed 300 people in the town of Aquila. Their predictions were not accurate, so they had to be punished. In 1953, Lacan warned against this kind of scientifically endorsed alienation, adding that we, as analysts, should surely not contribute to it. At the same time, he was quite confident that we were heading for a new science where the opposition between exact and conjectural sciences would be erased. In his own words, this new order simply signifies a return to a notion of true science. I must have it somewhere on, yes, it is here. So in his own words, this new order simply signifies a return to a notion of true science. It is almost painful to read those pages today, because it has turned out exactly the opposite. The question about truth has disappeared under ton loads of supposedly scientific quantifications, and the liberal arts are on the brink of disappearing from the scientific curriculum. What Lacan calls the positivist reversal is more present than ever before. The second section of the Rome Discourse ends with a strong argument in favor of reconsidering time. Instead of measuring time in terms of clocks based on gravity, we should understand time as an intersubjective element that structures our thinking and our actions. And if we succeed in formalizing those essential dimensions, Lacan says, this will provide us with a scientific foundation both for the theory and the praxis of analysis. And this is clear from the title of the final section of the Rome Discourse, The Resonances of Interpretation and the Time of the Subject in Psychoanalytic Technique. One word sounds a bit strange in this title, the resonances. As we will see, this is a key idea. In this last part of the discourse, Lacan returns to the analytic praxis. How to arrange our work in such a way that the analysant achieves full speech. Copying Freud's style is not a good idea. We have to follow the principles that governed his interventions. As is obvious from Freud's case studies, says Lacan, these principles have to do with the dialectics of self-consciousness, and even more particularly, with the decentering of this consciousness of the self. And this echoes what Lacan had already said in the first part, quote, "For in the work the analysant does to reconstruct it for another, he encounters anew the fundamental alienation that made him construct it like another, and it has always destined it to be taken away from him by another." The resulting paradigm has everything to do with the structurally determined division of the subject. There's no such a thing as a complete individual. At that point in the text, Lacan refers to what he calls the primary language of desire, deciphered by Freud and systemized by Ernest Jones. In the light of Lacan's later theory, this part of the Rome Discourse has to be seriously amended. Symbols may have a more or less privileged relationship to certain signifieds. The fact remains that they are signifiers. And moreover, the enumeration by Jones of the primary significations comes down to what Lacan will summarize later under the heading of the lack of the other. Life and death, sexuality and the body are precisely those parts of the real for which there is no apt representation. And the myriads of so-called symbols referring to them testify precisely to this structural lack in the symbolic order. Further in the text, Lacan anticipates his later theory because unlike Jones and the post-Freudians, he does not interpret these symbols. On the contrary, he evokes their power by operating on their resonances, that is, on their ambiguity or equivocality. This is all the more important because speech may transform the subject via the relationship with the one who speaks. And this has nothing to do with sign language or with communication, as in the case of honeybees. Even on the contrary, the intervention of the analyst has to be invocative rather than informative. And the reason why is found in something that is so obvious that it is often enough neglected. the analytic praxis is a dialectical enterprise. The analysand is looking for himself by sending a message to the analyst. The risk with informative and explanatory interpretations is that the analyst gives an answer. That is, that the analyst, instead of recognizing the subject, objectifies the patient. A classic example in this respect is what happened between Freud and Dora. As an 18-year-old intelligent adolescent in Victorian Vienna, she was desperately looking for her female identity and her sexual desire via a newly formed Oedipal triangle with the K couple. Although Freud enters the dialectical exchange, he failed to recognize Dora's desire by giving her all too soon what he considered to be the right answers. 100 years later, that is today, in contemporary psychiatry and psychotherapy, this kind of mistake has become the rule. Today, patients are told why they are patients, what the denomination of their disorders is, and how they should live with it. The expression psychoeducation is used without any irony whatsoever. As I said earlier, this risk was already mentioned by Lacan in the second section of the Rome Discourse, where he criticized the alienating scientific objectifications. The result of such interventions is that the subject identifies with such language and in the process loses itself because he or she is turned into an object. At that point of the text, Lacan starts elaborating his view on time and temporality with respect to the subject and the analytic praxis. And there is a really beautiful quote to give here. What is realized in my history is neither the past definite of what was, since it is no more, nor even the perfect as what has been in what I am, but the future anterior as what I will have been, given what I am in the process of becoming. It is not an easy sentence, and the trouble in understanding it has everything to do with the gist of it, namely uncertainty. The subject constitutes itself in his speech to the other. The realization of the subject, remember the title of the first chapter, the realization of the subject is always a question of becoming. And the role of the other is important, and it is here that Lacan talks about the responsibility of the analyst. The analyst may teach the patient to get a hold of himself as an object, be it an imaginary one, and then we are alienating the patient. And hence, at that point, the analyst operates in the service of resistance. Or the analyst may disalienate, unalienate the subject, which is the necessary condition for change. This is the advent of true speech and the realization by the subject of his history in its undetermined relation to the future. These two alternative possibilities are sharply delineated by Lacan. Either the analytic practice is reduced to a phantasmatic relationship between the analyst and the patient, analogous to a kind of dry lovemaking. Lacan refers to the practice of bundling, a kind of dry lovemaking based on a shared illusion. And this illusion makes us believe that the analyst has to look beyond the wall of language for the reality of the patient. A patient who believes that the analyst knows the truth about him on beforehand. In contrast to this illusion, we find Lacan's conception. The analytic practice is a dialectical relation where the analyst refrains from intervening and thus guides the associations of the subject in the direction of the realization of his truth. This refraining from intervention brings Lacan to what is at first sight a paradox. One of the analyst's refusals of responding has a huge impact on the reality of the analytic session, namely when the analyst intervenes on the actual duration of a session. And this introduces a tricky subject, the relationship between time and analysis, probably one of the most difficult things to think about. By way of introduction, Lacan reminds us of what is obvious. It is impossible to predict the total duration of an analysis. Even more so, Freud's intervention in this respect with the Wolfman proves that it is a very bad idea to put a fixed term on the duration, because this confirms the illusion of the analysant about the analyst knowing everything about him on beforehand. Now, the very same reasoning can be applied for the termination of each individual session, because suspending a session will always be experienced by the analysant as a punctuation of his discourse. Instead of deploring this, we should use it, says Lacan, because it gives us a possibility for intervention that is neglected when we are sticking to a standard time. Even more so, especially obsessional patients discover soon enough the advantages of a standard time limit, as it suits their typical defense system. Using a variable duration makes this impossible. This makes sense, especially in view of the obsessional stance towards death. What is unclear from Lacan's reasoning is why this variable duration became soon enough synonymous with short sessions. As is well known, this was a bridge too far for the IPA and one of the main reasons for Lacan's expulsion. Anyhow, duration and termination are intimately linked to the final closure, meaning death. And the last part of the Rome discourse treats this subject. First of all, in relation to the obsessional who awaits the death of the other, but soon enough the discourse goes on a much larger scale. At the beginning of his talk, Lacan had criticized the reduction of psychoanalysis to an instinct theory, let alone to neurobiology. Instead of that, he had promoted the function and field of language and speech. Now, in the final pages, he criticizes the all too easy reading of the death instinct that combines it with a kind of primordial masochism. Instead of that, he will put forward an essential relationship between death and the symbolic order, meaning between death and the subject. That there is an essential relationship between being human and death was already known from philosophy. Linking it to the symbolic order and the becoming of the subject as such is new. And together with the section on time, this is yet another difficult part of the Rome discourse. And for his final theory, Lacan refers to Freud on the life and death drive, eros and thanatos. The subject that is about to be longs for an original mythical union as present in eros, And that is why the child in Freud's Beyond the Pleasure principle repeats its foretold game endlessly in an effort to regain what is lost. And this loss does not concern the mother, nor the mother's breast, as every young mother experiences when she tries to soothe her child. Whatever she gives, it will never be enough. What the child wants to reinstall is the original union from before the separation, the union that stood for eternal life as well. The human child accompanies his repetition by symbols in an effort to gain mastery. And this is already clear in Freud's example of the forward and the repetitive game. For Lacan, the net result of his repetition, and especially of the use of signifiers, is exactly the opposite. The use of signifiers endorses the original loss. And this is already present in the structural linguistics by de Saussure, although in a much more prosaic way. The signifier has only a loose, arbitrary relationship with the signified and has nothing to do with the actual object. In Lacanian terms, the separation with the thing is irrevocably installed once we use signifiers. More particularly, the separation between mother and child, between subject and other, is irrevocably installed once they speak. For Lacan, this separation from the real, by introduction of the symbol, implies the death of the thing. At the same time, this means that the desire of the subject is eternalized. The subject will never be able to join the object because the symbol has made that impossible. That is the irony. The means to reinstall the union of eros are at the same time the cause of the separation by thanatos. At that point in the text, we find a well-known quote. Thus the symbol first manifests itself as the killing of the thing, and this death results in the endless perpetuation of the subject's desire. In the final pages of the Rome Discourse, Lacan hints at the effects of what he will call later the advent or the becoming of the subject. A naive, romantic reading might put the accent on the desire for the ever-lost object, while lamenting the human condition. A Freudian reading takes both basic drives into account, one driving us towards union, the other towards separation. A Lacanian reading stresses the transmission, the transfer of this conflict in the dialectical exchanges between subject and other and its effects. What seems to be the desire of the subject comes down to an identification with the desire of the other. In an attempt to affirm oneself, the subject may react with the possibility of its own death. He asserts himself with respect to others as a death wish. And this idea will receive a central importance at the time of Seminar 11, when Lacan elaborates his theory on the becoming of the subject. The central question of the subject to be to the other is, veut-il me perdre? Can he afford to lose me? And that is about the point where the Rome Discourse stops. So this is a point for my stop as well, for a pause, and then I will retake with a final part, focusing on the changes that Lacan made at the time of Seminar 11 on a number of important respects. So we have a break for something like a quarter of 10 minutes, I don't know.
10 minutes, no more.
10 minutes.
25 to.
So we are about to finish our marathon. It will take me another half an hour, so it's not that long anymore. I considered it necessary to make a linkage between the Rome discourse and seminar 11, because otherwise a number of things might be misunderstood based on the Rome discourse itself if you stick to it. So the final part of my talk addresses the following question: what are the important changes in Lacan's theory with respect to the Rome discourse? And the focus in these changes are obvious from the title of the introductory paper in the Écrit that heads the Rome discourse. I have already given you the title, but I will repeat it: on the subject who is finally in question. And the main part of these changes are elaborated some 10 years later in seminar 11. So my thesis runs as follows: the Rome discourse, in combination with the early seminars, presents us with Lacan's return to Freud. From seminar 10 onwards, we meet with a different Lacan, one who presents a new theory on psychoanalysis, and its innovative character resides at least in three typically Lacanian concepts or notions. First of all, his theory on the unconscious. Secondly, the concept of the subject. And thirdly, the notion that there is a structurally determined lack. And of course, the gist of these ideas can already be found in the early Lacan as well. It's always a bit arbitrary to put it into first and then middle and late Lacan. But in my reading, seminar 11 is a turning point. I started my talk this morning with a short note on the historical circumstances. The battle between Lacan and the IPA was concluded in the fall of '63, when he was officially expelled from the International Association. As a result, in that fall of '63, he stopped his yearly seminar after one session. And it is certainly not a coincidence that the subject of the seminar that he intended to give was announced as the names of the fathers, in the plural. In January '64, he starts a new seminar that afterwards will be known as the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. At the same time, it is the start of a new psychoanalytic school that in the years to come will develop into an international movement alongside the IPA, obliging the latter to reconsider a number of things. In my opinion, without Lacan, psychoanalysis as such would not have survived. Now, to go back to this new psychoanalysis, I can argue that the Lacanian Lacan will address Freud's fundamental problems. Studying Freud ends with at least 3 major questions. For the early Freud, trauma is very important, but it is hard to understand how a trauma coming from the other finds an inscription in the unconscious. The same difficulty concerns desire. That's the second one. All the trouble concerning our desires is due to the prohibition by the other. But lifting this prohibition does not present us with the expected result, even on the contrary, and hence the idea of an analysis being interminable. Finally, a psychoanalytic treatment amounts to the patient becoming conscious of a number of things. But it is the transferential relationship towards the analyst that makes this possible or impossible. These three Freudian problems can be summarized in one question. Whose unconscious are we talking about? Lacan's return to Freud, as highlighted in the Rome Discourse, makes explicit what is already present in Freud. The unconscious is structured as a language. The unconscious thought processes come down to linguistic mechanisms that are governed by inherent rules or even laws, as Lacan calls them. And he stressed the fact that we should not be seduced by the meaning of words. Even on the contrary, it is the material aspect of the signifier that appears prominently in this linguistic determination. And it is precisely this material aspect and its determination that explains why free association is not free at all, and how symptoms are determined. Let me give you an example coming from a very brief clinical vignette presented by Freud in a letter to Fliess, dated the 29th of December 1897. The patient is a young man whose main problem is what is called in German Unschlüssigkeit. In English translation, he is unable to make up his mind. And the English expression is really beautiful if you think about it. This is the first thing in the morning that every one of us has to do. We have to make up our mind, remembering who we are, where we are, what is expected from us. And sometimes this making up our mind is less self-evident, especially with the jet lag. For this patient, it is a continuous problem. And during a session, he tells about a scene going back to the age of 10. He was pursuing a beetle, trying to catch it, and at that moment, he experienced a panic attack. And it is not the first time that this memory pops up during his analysis via the free association. But in this particular session, he adds that it must have been a ladybird, and starts to laugh. It is the end of the session, and Freud reacts more or less dismissive. There must be more to it, he says. And the next session brings a surprising analysis. Beetle in German is Käfer. A ladybird beetle is a Marienkäfer. The patient was raised in the Viennese bourgeoisie, meaning that he had a French nanny and that his parents from time to time spoke French. And the memory about the beetle proves to be a screen memory because it evokes, just think about the resonances in the Rome Discourse, because it evokes the French que faire, which sounds exactly the same as que faire. Que faire means in French, what do I have to do? And was the expression used by his mother when she was dating the man who became later the father of the patient. The patient has learned about this expression when he overheard a conversation between his grandmother, the mother of his mother, and his aunt. Que faire? Will I marry this man or not? And the determination via the signifier becomes even more obvious if we add Marienkäfer. Se marier in French means to get married. And que faire in German is also a slightly derogatory expression for a woman. And on top of all this, the first name of the patient's mother was Marie. So this is one of the many examples that we can find in Freud, illustrating Lacan's thesis about the unconscious being structured as a language. There is a determinative line running from the obviously edible symptom Unschlüssigkeit to the mother's doubts whether she would marry this particular man, the father of the patient, or not. As beautiful as this analysis may be, it leaves us with the impression of a determination from which it is quite hard to escape. Indeed, if everything is determined, then there is no possibility for change. And Lacan confronted us with this problem in his Rome discourse as well, together with an embryonic answer. And the gist of this answer has to do with a completely new formula. The unconscious is the discourse of the other. I still find it strange that this particular formula has not raised more attention, because it is really shocking. Our unconscious, what we consider to be the most intimate part of our subjectivity, is not ours. On the contrary, it comes from the other. And this is a revolutionary idea, but at the same time, it was there from the very beginning. It is even obvious in Freud's small vignette. And if we focus too much on the linguistic wordplay, we run the risk of overseeing the most fundamental part in this symptom formation. That is, the que faire expression comes from the mother, just as the symptom is coming from her as well. Will I be able to make up my mind to marry this particular man or not? Freud's patient is troubled by the symptoms and the neurotic conflict of his mother. That is the problem. In the light of Lacan's new theory, the therapeutic question is, how can we escape the unconscious of the other? And his answer brings a new elaboration on the unconscious as such, in combination with his two other innovations, meaning the theory on the subject and on the structural lack. So let's go now to Seminar 11. Seminar 11 starts with Lacan's attempt to redefine the unconscious. And in this respect, the title of the second chapter of Seminar 11 is very telling. It runs as follows: the Freudian unconscious and ours. The way in which Lacan defines the unconscious is indeed new. The unconscious is not a topos, a place. It is an always failing process that appears between cause and effect, precisely at the point of failure. Something opens, but is almost immediately closed. And what happens in the gap in between is a failure. And that is precisely what Lacan calls the unconscious, operating on a causal level. And the strange thing about causality is that a cause in itself is not determined. Hence, the status of the unconscious. For Lacan, it is something pre-ontological, and hence the negative expressions he uses. The unborn, the unrealized. In Lacan's own words, because the unconscious shows us the gap through which the neurosis adheres to a real that may well not be determined. And in the same lesson, he stresses something that is very important for our analytic practice. I quote, "It is always about the subject as indeterminated that it goes." This is important because it opens a possibility for change, in contrast to the deterministic viewpoint. We can only imagine how surprised his audience in January 1964 must have been when they were listening to all this. The unconscious operating as a causal gap that in itself is not determined, that is pre-ontological. And what about the unconscious being structured as a language? What about the unconscious as the discourse of the other? The answer to these questions lies in the differentiation made by Lacan between the unconscious as such and the productions of the unconscious, meaning the symptoms. The productions are determined, and this determination explains why we can work on them in our praxis via the free association. In contrast, their cause is not determined, and that is why there is an opening for change. In order to explain the difference between causality and determination, between the unconscious as such and the productions of the unconscious, Lacan refers to the Aristotelian theory about tyche and automaton. Tyche stands for the non-determined cause. Automaton is the determined series that follows. And the combination between the two of them is put forward in a very strong statement. Now, at this time and date, I am certain in my position to introduce in the domain of causality the law of the signifier in the place where this gap is produced. In his further elaborations, Lacan will argue that the chain of signifiers contains an inner determination, leading us to the point where the determination as such stops and confronts us with a gap. In its turn, this gap causes a new start of the signifying chain, leading again to a renewed confrontation with the gap. Both automaton and tyche have to do with what Lacan will coin as the subject. And this is the second innovation after his redefining of the unconscious. Within Lacanian circles, even today, the idea of the subject is more often than not used in a way that goes against Lacan's theory. Often enough, it is used as a more sophisticated denomination for subjectivity, and in the worst of cases, as a synonym for a person or even for the ego. Let us ask a simple question. What is Lacan's definition? Well, his answer is rather peculiar, because in his definition, he does not start from the subject. Even on the contrary, the starting point is the signifier. And the well-known quote runs as follows: "The signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier." And this explains the structurally determined division of the subject from one signifier to another, to yet another, etc., etc. A graphic representation of this process of subject formation might look like this. And as you can see, I have already added the object small a at the bottom. In the first lessons of Seminar 11, Lacan explains his audience how and why the chain of signifiers contains a determination, and this is the automaton. The cause of the chain and its determination has to do with a structural lack, as expressed by the idea of object A. Now, if you think this through, you are in for an important conclusion, because this means that the Lacanian subject belongs to the production of the unconscious. That is, the subject is a symptom. We could even consider it as the symptom par excellence. At the same time, this means that the subject is always a failure. It is the half-finished product of a process that never manages to get through, to get fully realized. So the subject will remain forever at this half-finished stage. And the signifying chain keeps running, and the subject is continuously but never fully produced, whilst being divided in and by this very movement. The inner determination will make it possible to deconstruct this chain, and hence will make it possible to deconstruct the subject via the free association. But this determination is never a total one, because the reason why the chain itself starts has to do with an original lack that can never be answered, and that is the tuche. Later in his theory, Lacan will coin this as the real, and more particularly the real at 3 important points. The woman does not exist, the other of the other does not exist, there is no such a thing as the sexual relationship. In my summary, all 3 of them come down to the drive, more particularly to that traumatic part of the drive that can never be represented. It is literally unimaginable, unthinkable, undreamt of. And the last expression is truly psychoanalytical. We can't even represent this part of the real in our dreams. It is the point where the dream wakes the dreamer, usually in a state of anxiety. So, the subject is the product of a dialectic process between cause and determination. I have used a few times the expression inner determination, and this is correct as long as we stick to the chain as such. The clinical vignette with the Kiefer is an illustration of such an inner determination. But the same example demonstrates that this determination comes from the other, for the simple reason that language comes from the other. At this point, we meet with the combination of 2 well-known Lacanian theses. On the one hand, the unconscious is structured as a language. On the other hand, the unconscious is the discourse of the other. Now, this last formula, the unconscious is the discourse of the other, this last formula might as well be understood as the subject is the discourse of the other. And this explains why the subject is never fully realized. On the contrary, it joins the pre-ontological status of the unconscious. And the production process might be rendered graphically, as you can see on the screen. You could say that this is a screenshot of a process that never stops. An attempt to represent the continuity of this process might give this. Later on, in seminar 20, Lacan will refer to this process in a quote that is also very well known. It is that what never stops of never being written. Now, let us return to an important part in this reasoning about the subject. And that is the relation to the other and the possibility for change. As I said earlier on, based on Lacan, in this respect, a new question might be formulated as follows. How can we ever escape the unconscious of the other? How can we escape its determinative effect? In clinical terms, what are the possibilities for change based on a psychoanalytic treatment? Until now, I have focused on the first process and what Lacan coins as the advent of the subject. And that first process is, of course, the alienation or the identification with the signifiers of the other, because we want to answer the desire of the other. And the result of this process is the empty speech of the ego as the imaginary instance par excellence. And as I said earlier on, in this respect, Lacan quotes T.S. Eliot. We are the hollow man, we are the stuffed man, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw. These identifications are the building blocks of the subject and present us with the automaton. But as you all well know, there's a second process as well, the separation, based on the confrontation with the lack in the other and even the lack beyond this other. Separation is the opposite process in as much as it redirects the subject towards its supposedly being, thus opening a possibility of escape from the all-determining alienation. It presents us even with a possibility of choice, albeit a precarious one. As is clear from the presentation, the two processes of alienation and separation are circular and dissymmetrical. The cause of this continuous movement is the existence of a twofold lack, of a double lack. The process of alienation conducts the subject through the signifying chain of the other, but inevitably it will stumble upon the lack of the other, indicated by the slash. He is or she is saying this to me, but what does he or she truly desires? And thus confronted with the nameless desire of the other, the subject will produce a very typical answer. Am I the one who can fulfill his desire? And this means that the subject answers the lack of the other by presenting his or her own disappearance. Can the other afford to lose me? And at this point, the dissymmetry enters into the dialectics. The lack of the other within the signifying chain is answered by a presentation of the lack at an anterior level, that is death as a real loss. And hence the non-reciprocity and the dissymmetry by which the two processes topples over into the direction of alienation again. Of course, this elaboration in Seminar 11 sounds rather tragic, and in a certain way it echoes the existentialistic philosophy of that time, with suicide as the preeminent example of freedom. In his later work, Lacan will accentuate a more positive side. We need the opening in the other and the symbolic, just as we need the certainty of death, because otherwise choice would be unthinkable or irrelevant. We can take our distances from the other and his desire and make a number of choices for ourselves. But the necessary precondition is the recognition of a structural lack. And that brings me to the third fundamental Lacanian innovation. As you may know, one of the major critiques formulated by Lacan on object relations theory is that it focused too much on the object and all its different pregenital shapes and forms. And as a result, the most important thing tends to be forgotten. The fact that there is no original object. Even the mother is not good enough to answer the primordial lack that is installed from birth onwards. Lacan goes even further. It is at the very moment of conception that we lose the most fundamental thing there is, namely eternal life. And there is nothing philosophical about that, but because it is a biological fact caused by the meiosis, the particular cell division that takes place during sexual reproduction. Reproduction based on mitosis guarantees eternal life. Based on meiosis, it guarantees death. Something flees away at birth, says Lacan, and he talks about the lamella, and that something that flees away is eternal life. From that moment onwards, the organism, and he uses that term, that is not yet a subject, the organism strives to regain what is lost. Think about Freud and the life and death drives. In this case, the eros drive. Therefore, the child turns to the mother, and both of them enter into a dialectical exchange aiming at reinstalling the original union. Especially the child tries to answer the lack of the mother, and that is the start of the formation of the subject. Because of the structural character of the original loss, the identification with the signifiers of her desire will never be enough. The only result is that the lack receives a kind of upgrade, to put it in computer terms. Yeah. It is now turned into a lack on the level of demand and desire. What does the other desire from me? And as a result, the ego starts dreaming about a perfect answer. And this is all the more the case once this dialectic exchange moves to the level of the sexual relationship. There must be someone out there who has the phallus, who has the perfect answer to my lack, and vice versa. The net result of this conviction is a never-ending process of alienation and separation without ever finding the hoped-for result. The accompanying anxieties correspond to the two processes. Castration anxiety as the Oedipal version of separation anxiety. I am not enough. I do not have enough of the phallus to meet the desire of the other. On the other hand, there is the intrusion anxiety. The other wants too much of me. I have to run away. The common denominator in both anxieties is the idea that it is possible to answer the lack, only not by me. And this is what Lacan coins as the imaginary castration, as a typically neurotic stance towards the lack of the other. Obviously, this is quite a different theory from Freud's ideas about castration. For Lacan, every subject is castrated from the start, meaning that every one of us is marked by an existential loss. And the almost automatic answer is to translate this loss in guilt and in reparation. And the two privileged relations where this happens is the one between mother and child, and later on between romantic partners. The imaginary character of this castration has to do with the idea of completeness. Castration and loss are exceptions. Completeness is normal. In contrast to that, Lacan posits the symbolic castration and the not whole, le pas tout. The lack as such is structural and functions as a basic causality for everything human. In contrast to the pessimistic existential philosophy, this idea is a reason for optimism. The symbolic castration leaves an opening in the symbolic, in the other, meaning that every subject can escape from the all-encompassing alienation and determination. This is the point where we can make something ourselves, independently of the other. I come back to this idea, but before that, I want to stay a moment with the idea of a structurally determined lack. Today, the importance of this idea, of this concept, is becoming more and more obvious because it has simply disappeared. In the West, we are living in a discourse that tells us that there should be no lack whatsoever, that everything is available, that everything is predictable and controllable. If something is lacking or if something goes wrong, this means that someone is to blame. And this is also the case in psychotherapy and healthcare. And the risk of such a discourse is total alienation, as was already mentioned by Lacan in Fonction et champ de la parole et du langage. I consider our era as dominated by a perverse Big Brother discourse, in contrast to the neurotic patriarchal discourse of yesterday. I call it a perverse discourse because castration is denied as such, but that's another story. By way of conclusion, I would like to look at the clinical implications of the Rome discourse, albeit in combination with the theory on the advent of the subject. Let me remember you the title of the first chapter of the Rome discourse: Empty Speech and Full Speech in the Psychoanalytic Realization of the Subject. The implication of this title is that the subject has to be realized via the psychoanalytic treatment. The question is how we can understand and even encourage this realization, especially when confronted with a structural lack. And what about the analysis becoming interminable? In my reasoning, our clinical work contains two different parts, and in a certain way they echo the two processes in the formation of the subject. The first part of our job is all about analysis. By and large, via the free association, we meet with the automaton, the determination and the signifiers coming from the other. This is the unconscious that Lacan described rather poetically in his Rome discourse. It is obvious that this is the neurotic part that we have to get rid of. The analytic work, as Freud calls it, analytische Arbeit, the analytical work is a work of deconstruction. And the clinical vignette about the Käfer man illustrates the way this works. The analytic goal in this first process is not the discovery of hidden unconscious meanings. No, the goal is to get rid of the determining effects of the signifiers coming from the other. And this is what I consider to be the therapeutic part of our job. And in case of neurosis, a psychoanalytic treatment is really helpful. If someone comes to see me and asks what analysis might do for him or her, my answer is that he might gain more freedom of choice instead of the inhibitions, symptoms, and anxiety he is living in. Now, this deconstruction part concerns the unconscious as the discourse of the other. And in this respect, the realization of the subject via the process of analysis, the realization of the subject is by and large a negative one, getting rid of these alienations. But what about the positive part of this realization? The part where the subject might be able to make choices on his own. Well, this is the tricky side, because more often than not, it is the point where analysis becomes interminable. And this interminability testifies to the still remaining belief in the other, resulting in further identifications and alienations in the subject. The most imaginary alienation is, of course, the identification with the analyst in the function of the final master. It is quite clear that this is not Lacan's idea of a happy ending. I can refer here again to a quote that I gave already several times. For in the work he does to reconstruct it for another, he encounters anew the fundamental alienation that made him construct it like another, and that has always destined it to be taken away from him by another. From this point in Lacan's theory onwards, a whole new reasoning will be developed, with seminar 20 as a kind of a highlight. The recognition of the symbolic castration entails at the same time the impossibility of a final answer for the subject within this symbolic order. The only solution is that the subject creates a symptom of one's own, written as le symptôme, as we heard several times yesterday. Creating a symptom of his own in a world that recognizes the not whole, le pas tout. At the end of seminar encore, Lacan evokes this idea, the creation of a new signifier, in talking about poetry. And this conclusion echoes the final paragraph of seminar 11, the final sentence even, where he defines the desire of the analyst as the desire for pure difference. I cannot think of a better formulation to conclude my paper. Thank you. I think there's time for some questions. If you still feel up to it, or you have a conclusion. Okay, sorry.
My question comes from an outsider to Lacanian thought. And one thing I want to thank you is that your presentation was very accessible. So that was a relief for me. I could follow it when I didn't get distracted by my own thoughts. So the question is, how would you understand what the relation of psychoanalysis or Lacanian psychoanalysis should be to neurobiology?
To?
Neurobiology.
That's a very difficult question because it has to be considered on a larger scale. What is the position of Lacanian psychoanalysis vis-à-vis science? So I wouldn't make an exception for neurobiology. I don't think that Lacan would be necessarily against neurobiology or against science. His question is, what is the position of the scientific discourse towards the lack? And in one of his most difficult papers, Science and Truth, he will make a differentiation between 3 or even 4 different possible relationships. Religion, science and psychoanalysis. I will stick to those 3. In matters of religion, the religious discourse, the Western religions, the relation towards the lack is quite simple. The lack is taken care of by God, and we don't have to bother about it. In case of science, the lack is denied. And he links it or foreclosed. No, he says he doesn't say that it's denied. He says that it's foreclosed. So he compares science to paranoia. In case of psychoanalysis, the lack is recognized by the subject in order to do something with it. So that would be the answer. Depending on the position science takes towards the lack, Lacan would either like it or dislike it. So if contemporary science and contemporary neurobiology is convinced that they will have the final answers, that they have them already, then he won't go for it. Just to give you an example, we have the new DSM-5. In the introduction, again, it is said, or the hope is expressed, that we will find the neurobiological and the genetic determinations of all the disorders without actually having any proof today. So this is a very strange position. They don't have any proof whatsoever, and in the meantime they start from that kind of belief. So religion and science are quite close together, and Lacan would reject that. But of course, there are neurobiologists who are operating in a different way. Yes. Yeah.
So it's not in the nature of
No. That is one of the beautiful things of Lacan's discourse theory. I'm not sure if you are familiar with the discourse theory, the 4 discourses. Do you know about it or not? Well, anyhow, it's a very abstract system in which he sets out 4 different relationships between the subject and the other. It's abstract in that way that he doesn't give a content to it. Just to give you an idea of the irony of it, the critique that I have, that Lacan formulates on science, might very well be given to a number of analytical theories themselves. So it's not about science, it's about a certain discourse that he takes his distance from.
Thank you.
Yeah.
In discussing the function and field of speech and language and the example from Purloin later about the unconscious and the use of the signifier, I get confused when I start thinking about the primacy of the signifier in Lacan compared with the signified from Saussure. In the 3rd seminar, Lacan says that meaning is imaginary.
That meaning is?
Meaning is imaginary.
Yeah.
And this relates to what you said yesterday, actually, about gardez-vous de le comprendre. And I wonder if it is true that the picture Lacan is drawing with the signified is the idea that we all wander around with a private language. I wonder if psychoanalysis can lose that. What would psychoanalysis look like without the signified? Is it necessary to have a signified and a private language schema?
Yes, those are 2 different things. The private language is not a private language, it's a private speech, which is quite different. So language is the field of language, and that comes down to a convention. So Lacan takes that from the Saussure, the convention of the language, meaning the other. And that convention may change. The speech that has to do with the alienation and the separation, with the individual stance towards the other. So you have to make a differentiation between those 2 things. Now, about the primacy of the signifier and the arbitrariness of the relation between signifier and signified, there is something strange in Lacan. In a number of places, not that many, he is talking about what in French it runs as follows: un signifiant donné par la nature, a signifier given by nature, which is very strange in the light of his theory on the arbitrariness of the signifier and the signified. And when he is talking about the signifier given by nature, he's always talking about difference. And you need difference in order to create signification. That's already in the Saussure. And the signification given by nature is the differentiation between man and woman based on the phallus. So in that respect, he is in contradiction with his own theory. But that's another part of the Lacanian theory.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And a comment. Really moved by your presentation. It's kind of reflecting in what one does in a public space with such clarity is really moving. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask you 2 questions. One is related to the status of the science that Lacan is kind of, you mentioned at the beginning, he's trying to state psychoanalysis as science, but also there's a big critique of that. So I want to hear a little bit about this ambivalence of what is this about? That on the one hand, he wants to assert psychoanalysis such as science, and on the other hand, he's criticizing that possibility. That's one question. The other is about the TK and the automaton. You talk about that in terms of the determination and causality. And if I remember well, in Seminar 11, these concepts are in under repetition. Is that right?
Yes.
And I'd like to see if you could give us a little bit of reflection about the because I remember he talks about the missed encounter in I don't remember if it is decay or automaton, and the fortune on the other hand, right? Like if you could touch on those, please.
Touch is a good word because that would require a whole new paper. The two questions are basically the same question. When he's talking about his hopes for what he calls conjectural sciences, he's referring to Aristotle. And he, as far as we know, he wanted to study both the determination, the automaton, and causality. Causality, about which he says that it is not determined in itself. Now, in hindsight, this is really very interesting because if you work as I do in academia nowadays, the idea of causality has disappeared. The scientists are always thinking in matters of correlation, not in terms of causality. They are afraid of causality. They can't even think in causal terms anymore. It's all about correlation and different forms of correlation, etc., etc. So it's a kind of symptom that the idea of causality and in science has disappeared, whilst it took a central place in the Aristotelian theory. We can only imagine what this kind of science could have been if Lacan's hopes would have turned out for the best. This is not the case, so I don't know, I can't answer it. And to be honest, I'm not that familiar with this part in Lacan's theory as well. You should invite my PhD student, he knows a lot more about that than I do. About the missed encounter, the rencontre toujours manquée, well, that expression, which he uses in several respects, the most well-known, of course, is in the romantic relationships. We had two beautiful interventions about that yesterday. The missed encounter is missed because of the conviction on beforehand that there must be a perfect answer. So if you start from that idea, every encounter is a missed one. But at the same time, and that's also in Seminar 20, Lacan is quite hopeful in that respect, that a missed encounter can gives us the opportunity for creativity, for creating something new, for creating something on our own. So there's a good part to it and a bad part to it. And that has then to do again with the fact that there is no determined answer and that we can create something starting from that lack. But again, this would require 2 other papers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe a follow-up as well before this other question. And I liked a lot what you were doing with the when you're talking about the unconscious opening and closing. And of course, he uses that metaphor about the cave that is never, the tourist attraction that is never open in, I think, the position of the unconscious paper, right? But I want to go back to the empty and full speech that you were discussing as well. And I don't know, I've seen some people like Dylan Evans and so on talk about this in terms of Heidegger and Reda and Gereda, so empty chatter and speech and that. And when you were talking about empty speech is coming from a full imaginary, was that the figure you were using? And yet Lacan also says that when you respond, when he's talking about frustration and aggressivity, when the analyst responds to empty speech, there's something that happens in that moment, I think. Mm-hmm. And would you say then, I mean, essentially, the moments of full speech, whether in the analytic situation or not, are very, very rare? Or is it the moment of the Freudian slip? Is that the truth that emerges at that point, and the course of the unconscious closes again? So if you want to elaborate a bit on that.
I think it is not that difficult to find instances during the analytic practice where the imaginary and the empty speech is very much present. And that is a point where we, as analysts, have to refrain from intervening. That's the point where the gardez-vous de comprendre is really important. The idea of full speech is, how would I put it, doesn't fit any longer in Lacan's theory from the moment that he elaborates the idea of the structural lack and the idea of the real. Because at that point he will redefine the idea of truth. In a beautiful sentence in French, he will speak about le mi-dire de la vérité, the half speaking of the truth. So you can only evoke it by resonance, as already in the fonction et champ, but you can never fully get at it. That would be the imaginary part. So it's elusive. And that's also why he uses the idea of the duration of the session. The moment it becomes too imaginary, the moment that that's one of the moments to short-circuit the session when a patient is losing himself in the imaginary. So that's the difficulty with this kind of talk. If we are focusing on this paper, a number of things change considerably later on in his later theory, and especially the idea of full speech disappears completely.
Hello, is this on? Okay,
Yes.
Thank you very much for the paper. I'm going to ask a question. As a practicing analyst, you brought in at the end clinical implications in two parts, 1 and 2, and I think what my question might actually be is how to translate what I'm asking you into Lacanian language. I'm not trained as a Lacanian analyst. The first part of deconstructing all the imaginary identifications, the symbolic chain, that feels very familiar. Mm-hmm. But the second part becomes much more tricky, the positive side of having the freedom of choice. And once the analysand gets to the position that they have a freedom of choice, part of what becomes the dilemma is it seems as if the big other also has to be deconstructed. Otherwise,
yes,
how can there actually be any choice? So there's always that balance between maintaining my own desire for absolute difference, but recognizing that most people who come into my practice are not intellectuals. They're sort of stuck in the chain of the signifiers of late capitalism. Mm-hmm. So there's always that challenge of how to create the space for freedom to emerge when people actually are oppressed. There was something in a panel yesterday that I was a little confused by, and the point was well made that some analysts feel like you have to convince somebody that they're being oppressed before they can begin, but I thought, well...
Foucault, that was the narrative therapy in the Foucauldian terms.
Yes, but on one hand, sometimes people do actually need to know they are being oppressed, even without giving them an answer to that. So I'm not quite sure... I guess as I'm saying, I'm trying to ask you to help me translate that into how a Lacanian would think about that clinically.
Well, first of all, you have understood it quite well when you were saying that it needs a deconstruction of the other. That's exactly what Lacan says. You have the deconstruction of the subject and the deconstruction of the other. Destitution subjective et le désêtre de l'analyste. Those are the two terms he uses in French. Now, about the intellectual part, this has nothing to do with intelligence. You don't need an intellectual for that. You can do it or you can't miss it with someone who is an intellectual. And it's not a total freedom of choice, of course. We shouldn't be too naive about that either. I think the most important part is, for us as therapists, as analysts, is the refusal to take a position where we give new answers. If they have deconstructed their neurotic determination, then they have experienced a kind of freedom. And in most cases, they will expect and even ask that we provide them with new answers in matters of sexual relationship, authority, the function of the father, etc., etc. Well, it's not our ethical position to give them. Yeah.
Deconstruct the other, just not give answers.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I wonder if you could just speak about the concept of la langue, because personally, I don't really understand whether it represents a sort of new paradigm of language, or and how it relates to the dialectic between speech and language?
Again, a very difficult question that requires another paper. That is seminar 20 and the next seminars. And it has to do with the relationship between signifiers and jouissance. So the signifier is the symbol is the death of the thing, and he, for a number of years, he will posit an opposition between the symbolic, between the signifier and the jouissance. And the jouissance will be a transgression, etc., etc. But at a certain point, he changes his ideas in that respect. And he will make a combination between the onset of jouissance and the starting point of the signifier. Because he says we need the signifier in order to fend off the jouissance and to have the road to go back to it. It's quite a difficult theory. Now I'm summarizing it very briefly. And the bridge between language as such, between the signifiers as we are using them, and the original linkage between jouissance and the symbolic system goes through la langue. And that's the language that exists between mother and child. The language with which the mother is marking, he uses that word, marking, is marking the jouissance on the body of the child. In that respect, and that may sound strange for a number of people in the audience, in that respect, you can make a connection between that part of Lacanian theory and contemporary attachment theory. There is a linkage. If you see how contemporary attachment theory is describing the interaction between mother and child in the care situation, and how language is operating in the what they call mirroring, that's quite close to what Lacan was describing in the 70s about la langue. Yes, that's a very, very brief summary of a very difficult subject, because it contains a reversal in his vision on jouissance.
I was wondering if you could talk about the ethical implications of kind of forcing people into facing their own lack or having to deal with that. And I guess the reason I'm asking is because I'm working in social work right now and in a group home.
Well, first of all, it's not a question of forcing people to take a position against vis-à-vis their own lack. We don't do that kind of thing. You can only work, and that's already in Freud as well, we can only work with people in analysis who have a demand, who are suffering, people for whom the determination is such that their life is turned into one big misery. You will never be able to confront someone with his or her lack if there is no misery, if there is no suffering. So it's not a question of a decision that we make. That's the beautiful thing in Freud when he's talking about the balance that is present in every symptom. Every symptom has a gain and a loss. And as long as the balance is in the direction of the gain, nothing will work. If the balance turns to the side of loss, then we can start working. So it's not our decision to take.
Yeah, I guess like as a psychoanalyst, you'd never do that. But I guess I'm working in the field of social work right now, and I'm feeling like it's kind of my job to get results with the people I'm working with. And I guess from my position, I can see that that's kind of what we're doing, is forcing people into that role where they have to deal with that. And so I'm just wondering if there is an ethical way to do that. I mean, sometimes it seems...
I'm more thinking about a clinical way, not so much an ethical way. It's our ethical position as analysts not to deny the lack and to help people eventually to confront it and to do something with it. Now, if you are working in social work, especially today, in the contemporary discourse where the lack as such is denied, where everyone is considered to be responsible, where everyone is considered to be able to control his or her life, then you are in for a hard job. because you have to go in, you have to go against the big other who denies the lack, and you have to work with people who don't want to confront their lack. So I wouldn't like to be in your shoes.
Okay.
I'd like to add my own thoughts in terms of what people are saying as compliments to the lucidity of your talk. And as that is a preface, I apologise if this sort of moves away from what you actually spoke on. But I was wondering if you could comment, and again, another kind of caveat before I start, because I haven't seen the documentary yet, so if I misrepresent it, I apologise. But I'm sure you're familiar about the controversy in France right now with the release of that documentary called The Wall, which deals with mainly, I would say, demonizing Lacanian psychoanalysts and what is framed or presented as their inability to deal with children who are on the autistic spectrum,
yes.
Or neuroatypical individuals who do not use language in the ways that conventionally we expect or accept in normative society. I'm wondering what the response has been from the Lacanian community, what your own thoughts are on the criticisms being mongered, if I will, in that film, and what can we take away from it in terms of our understanding of language from neuroatypical individuals and how they resist, and the documentarian says, are being bullied into using language in predictable and expected ways.
To be honest, I haven't followed it that much, but what I know about it is that the French Lacanian community reacted far too defensively. First of all, they should have given their point of view on the contemporary ideas about autism, which are, to say the least, very strange. There are a number of very decent scientific studies proving that this diagnosis is not useful. It has become so broad that you can understand almost anything under it, meaning that you can say anything about it and nothing is final. That would have been the most appropriate reaction. But instead of that, as far as I know, they have taken a very defensive stance, which is always a bad idea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, Paul, thank you for the talk. I think it was very interesting, and the way you were connecting function with seminar 11 and then seminar 20, I think it was great. My question is this. You were talking by the end about the clinical implications, and I think it's very important to have in mind that the way we read the theory becomes a way we practice,
yes, sure.
in everyday practice. So I think it's very important to have a good discussion, a good reading about the theory. Having said so, could you say something about the formation of the analyst? Because lately there's been a phenomenon. There is, I think, I don't know how to put it, but I think it's we are facing new analysts that are very well trained in the theory, that are within school, and that are practicing out there, but they are doing just psychotherapy in the action, right? They are, we can even say they are doing Lacanian psychotherapy because of the way they do the treatment, the way they understand the theory. It's only about concepts, right? They are using the lack, object PTA, the other, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, they are doing psychotherapy. So I think we really have to think about it in terms of how an analyst is formed. And of course, what Lacan and Freud say is about the three different things, right? Study of the theory, then the analysis of the analyst, and also the control of our practice, right? So could you say something about it?
I think we have to be aware of the fact that today, 60 years after Fonction et Chant, that we are in the post-Lacanian era. And most of us are not aware of that. If I see my students and my younger colleagues, most of them are reading commentaries on Lacan. And they are not reading Lacan any longer himself because he's far too difficult and it takes too much time. The implication is that we are seeing, if you look at it from that point of view, that we are seeing the same mistakes as during the post-Freudian era. So in many respects, this is a similar era as the what I would call the post-Freudian era. And probably within some 30 or 40 years, we will have someone who will preach a return to Lacan. That wouldn't surprise me at all. I have been present in many, many discussions about Lacanian theory, where the discussion didn't refer to Lacan any longer, but to what I would consider post-Lacanians. And that's a pity. I think the studying Lacan is, of course, time-consuming and it's difficult, but it gives you much more than reading, for instance, my work. Don't read my work, take Lacan. So to come back to the idea of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, well, that's the same thing as happened in the post-Freudian era. Analysis was replaced by psychotherapy without the analyst knowing about it. That said, I'm not against psychotherapy. On the contrary, I think psychotherapy is really important. And it obliges us to ask what analysis as such is. And I guess most of us, for most of the time, are doing psychotherapy. And from time to time, we take an analytic position for someone. And that is really interesting if you look at it from the point of view of the four discourses. And those are moments that you take in the analytic position via the analytic discourse. But for most of the time, I would say we function as psychotherapists. Psychotherapy in the original meaning of the word, because that is changing as well. Nowadays, and that will be the same over here, I think, psychotherapy is becoming an illustration of Foucault. Psychotherapy in the contemporary version is becoming a new form of discipline, of disciplining people. It's not psychotherapy as it used to be in the 70s or the 80s. The example that illustrates the case most eminently is children and ADHD. Treatment consists of making them more, having more attention and sitting still. So that's discipline. That's not psychotherapy. And you can take that as a paradigm for the contemporary evolution of psychotherapy. So we don't want to do that kind of thing.
I think we have time for one more question.
I have one.
Anyone? if there's anyone who hasn't spoken yet. But maybe Hilda then.
Yeah, I was just thinking also what you are saying is a little bit the domestication, right?
Yes, domestication.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to reflect a little bit on what circulated in terms of the social work and what Emily was saying about how and it's a constant tension that we experience, for example, in the Lacan Salon between the singularity of the individual that goes to analysis to deal with the existence, pretty much, right? Yeah. And how we can take this model out of the consulting room and towards the social, right? Which implies, obviously, a lot of other political situations. I totally agree with, I don't know your name, but the social worker here, about how the system has a mechanism of implementing the castration of the subject in it's your fault, it's your responsibility, that kind of thing. So I could say that to take the psychoanalysis out there into the social, as it is done already in many places, right? Latin America, Europe, there are places that work with clinics for people with autistic disorders or bulimics or whatever, psychosis very much so, from a Lacanian perspective. It doesn't mean that you are going to put them in the couch, but there's an informed practice by these ethics. So my point was that, yeah, it has to involve the system as well, right? Like a critique, a very strong critique of how the system is implementing some of these readings of the suffering individual. And just to finish my intervention, in terms of what Jorge was saying regarding the formation, I go back to what I was saying yesterday about the ethical act, right? The psychoanalyst authorizes himself, but in front of others through her or his act. And that's something that we shouldn't forget, right?
Okay, thank you. I think we can conclude on that idea. I agree completely. Yeah.
Thanks again, Paul, for a wonderful talk. The moment to conclude. In Ridley Scott's tech-noir Blade Runner, Roy Batty, played by Rutger Hauer, leader of the renegade humanoid replicants, utters the following last words to bounty hunter Deckard, played by Harrison Ford. "I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watched C-beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser Gate. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die." Having traversed the weekend of LaConference and listened to the spangling insights of our presenters and audience members, I feel a lot like Roy. The next time I'm asked that question by friends, colleagues, family members, so what's Lacan about then? I'm compelled to directly draw on this weekend and reply, we talk about things you people wouldn't believe. Groucho Marx's impossible love, Richard of St. Victor's Trinity, the limits of DSM-5 and paranological thought, the jouissance of hoarded objects. Like Roy's built-in lifespan of 4 years, my final remarks' built-in lifespan of about 8 minutes or so is a measly sum to live out all those moments that comprised LaConference 2013. Before I get to the wrap-up time to conclude, let me remind you that there's one final event still today, the screening of Larry Clark's Martha Girl at 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. And the location, Chris, is here. So, to begin with, I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed to the success of LaConference, especially our sponsors, SFU Woodwards, the many speakers, the even more attendees, especially to Paul for making this journey to give such a brilliant talk. And I think he richly deserves his vacation to come on Vancouver Island. Also wish to thank the vetting committee who helped select the papers. Again, thanks to Hilda and Clint for their continuing desire to guide the salon, now I believe in its 7th year. Hopefully this weekend has incited your desire to join the salon, perhaps for the first time. There are 2 meetings left for this season, so see the website for details. Or perhaps it's renewed current salon members' desire to keep going with their participation. Now, there's one person I have not mentioned for the thanks, and his name is Chris Jajava. Chris, can you stand up one more time? a little gift for you. A gift of wine, not shit. It's quite nice wine. If wine is truth, then the truth of LaConference is Chris's months and months of hard work, often toil, sometimes works of love, to create this event. And if anyone has ever experienced the work that goes into organizing a conference, or maybe even just a paper session, you will know that much of the labor is taking on and dealing with the contingencies of people, their whims, the contingencies of objects, computers and remote controls not working all of a sudden. Recalling Lacan's definition of television of the martyr and the saint, much like the analyst, as someone whose quote, business is, to put it clearly, is not caritas, rather he acts as trash, his business being trashitas, the saint is the refuse of jouissance, unquote. Chris has probably had to deal with a lot of crap which comes in with the work of organizing a conference. I think then that we could rightly regard Chris as Saint Christopher. Saint Chris has carried us in this conference across the rivers of thought that have comprised this event. So Chris, thanks for guiding us across this potentially dangerous river that is not simply the organization, but also the ongoing maintenance of the conference as it takes place. So I think he deserves a round of applause. And I kindly ask the floor people, the lights people who've done a tremendous job as well, could you slightly dim the lights, please? Probably at their dimmest. Now, I hope that you all will one day become fellow travelers with us again, with St. Christopher and his band, be that in this salon or the next LaConference in 2015, most likely, every 2 years. Parting, as Shakespeare reminds us, is such sweet sorrow. So, but what better way to conclude than to consider the importance of the wateryness of sorrow and tears? I began with Blade Runner and the replicant's Tears in the Rain, and I'd like to end, and sadly we don't have any rain outside today, and it would have added to my watery metaphors. I'd like to end with a song by Feste, the Fool in Twelfth Night, that brings to the fore the bittersweet sorrow of life, and also the bittersweet ending of such an event as the conference. When I was, and a little tiny boy, with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain, a foolish thing was but a toy, for the rain it raineth every day. But when I came to man's estate, with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain, 'gainst knaves and thieves men shut their gate, for the rain it raineth every day. But when I came, alas, to wive, with hey-ho, the wind and the rain, by swaggering could I never thrive, for the rain it raineth every day. But when I came unto my beds, with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain, with tosspots still had drunken heads, for the rain it raineth every day. A great while ago the world began, with a hey-ho, the wind and the rain. But that's all one, our play is done, and we'll strive to please you every day. Thank you, safe travels, and see you again soon.